In 1876, General George Armstrong Custer and 200 men of the 7th Cavalry were defeated and killed at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. 1879, a British army of 1,200 was annihilated by the Zulus in the Battle of Isandlwana. Disasters and defeats, and fairly well known. There was another battle in another war, not so well known, when a British-American force of more than 300 men was defeated by 800 warriors. With their officers killed or wounded, the survivors barely saved themselves by a fighting retreat. 2 sergeants kept order and prevented a rout becoming a slaughter. Those sergeants and 2 others were awarded Medals of Honor, the highest US award for bravery, the equivalent of Britain's Victoria Cross. What battle was it? It was the Battle of Tagalii. It took place in Samoa on the afternoon of April 1, 1899. The Samoan leader was this man, Josefa Mataafa. Mataafa led his men with brilliantly planned and executed tactics. He was one of the few indigenous leaders in history who took on colonial forces and beat them in battle. The war he fought was a war in paradise. Mataafa commanded warriors like these, and they were not only well led, they were disciplined and experienced in the tactics and strategy of battle, and they were armed with modern rifles. Some of them were women warriors. The war saw the first time that American, British and Australian servicemen fought as allies. The war was also the first time that US servicemen fought under the command of a non-American officer, and that officer was Ballarat-born Lieutenant Guy Gaunt. Gaunt became known as the man who saved a king when he smuggled the young king out of a missionary compound and threw hundreds of rebels, disguising him as his servant. Later, Gaunt led a force of picked men, and women warriors too, to final victory at the hard-fought Battle of Vailima. In 1899, Samoa was the last independent nation of the region. Although independent, it was divided into zones of influence. In the west, the Germans, and in the east, the Americans. The succession to the kingship ignited a bloody war, in which one side was backed by the British and Americans, and the other by the Germans. This is Mulinu today, quiet and peaceful Harbourside Park. Difficult to believe that just over 100 years ago, a boy king had to take refuge virtually on this very spot, behind entrenchments manned by US Marines with machine guns. Europeans arrived to settle in Samoa in the mid-19th century. The locals gave them a patch of unwanted ground on a swamp. Europeans arrived to settle in Samoa in the mid-19th century. The locals gave them a patch of unwanted ground on a swamp near the sea. It became the settlement of Apia and was placed under the administration of Europeans. By the 1890s, it had the appearance of a small country town. Today, it is the main city and the capital of the nation. Europeans also brought firearms. The firearms made tribal conflicts more deadly. There were wars in 1848 and the 1860s that transformed the face of war in Samoa. The European powers decided to intervene when a new war broke out in 1873 between rival claimants to the kingship, Malietoa Laupepa and Mataafa Josefa. Malietoa Laupepa was a former king, drawn here sitting with his senior official, the royal orator, and he was sent into exile. The Americans and British supported a new candidate, Mataafa Josefa. He was crowned king in September of 1888. However, there was renewed unrest, and in a reversal of fortunes in 1889, the representatives of Britain, the the United States and Germany resolved that Malietoa Laupepa should be returned as king. When Mataafa protested, he was exiled instead, accompanied by his senior chiefs and his family. In those days, locals found it hard to argue with gunboat captains. One European settler who arrived in Samoa in 1890 was the well-known author Robert Louis Stevenson. He was seeking relief from chronic illness in Samoa's benign climate, and he built a house at Vailima in the hills near Apia. This is Stevenson's house, although expanded from what was built in his day. Stevenson died in Vailima in 1894 and was buried on this hilltop near his house. This is the tomb of Robert Louis Stevenson. I've always admired his writing and look forward to reading some of the works of the great man where he himself is lying at rest. The book I've chosen, maybe appropriately, is Stevenson's book on war in Samoa. And he writes, "War, to the Samoan of mature years, is often an unpleasant necessity. To the young boy, it is a heaven of immediate pleasures, as well as an opportunity of ultimate glory." In my words, these were a people prepared to fight hard for their rights and their honour. In 1898, the solution that the great powers had imposed fell apart on the death of King Malietoa Laupepa. The Germans returned Mataafa Josefa from his exile to take the throne. The Americans and British, however, judged that the kingship should devolve upon his dead king's son, Malietoa Tanu Mafili I. He was a young man, just 14, educated in New Zealand, fluent in English, and preferring to wear European clothes. The British seemed to see him as a plucky little chap. However, most Samoans thought that Mataafa, although by then an old man, had an equal, even stronger claim to the kingship. Your Highness, why was it that so many of the Samoan people supported Mataafa in his bid for the kingship?
Clearly, he was, by common consent, the outstanding leader at that point. And this was shown by the way that people rallied around his standard. So that's, in a nutshell, was how we saw it.
The British and the Americans determined to have their way, and gunboats were sent to Samoa. The first to arrive was a small cruiser of the Australian squadron, HMS Porpoise. The Porpoise was commanded by a man who would later win fame as an admiral in World War I, Frederick Doveton Sturdy. A lieutenant in the Porpoise was Australian Guy Gaunt. As events heated up, the followers of the boy king gathered around another experienced chief and war leader, the renowned warrior Tamasese. This building behind me today is the Museum of Samoa. In 1898, it was the courthouse. The decision passed here on 31st December 1898 at around 11 o'clock in the morning was an act that started the war. The question of who was the rightful claimant to the throne had been submitted for arbitration to the Chief Justice of Samoa, an American named Chambers. On the day the decision was to be handed down, Sturdy sent Gaunt with 20 armed sailors to protect the courthouse. It was as well that he did. Here, in a photo of the moment of judgment, Chambers is standing, and Gaunt can faintly be seen standing in a doorway. What is unseen is the revolver that the Chief Justice had hidden underneath his court papers. When word was spread that the Chief Justice had favoured Malietoa Tanu over Mataafa Josefa, fighting broke out, and Malietoa's supporters were driven into Apia. Malietoa himself was rescued by Lieutenant Gaunt with 25 sailors from HMS Porpoise. Just when the British were hard-pressed to hold Apia for Malietoa, powerful reinforcements arrived here in Apia Harbour. The cruisers Tauranga and Royalist from Sydney, and the US cruiser Philadelphia. Philadelphia had a crew of 350 men, including Marines, and was the flagship of Rear Admiral Albert Coutts, who took command of the Allied war effort. Apia Harbour became filled with British and US ships. Strong parties were sent ashore to fortify the US consulate and the British consulate, as well as strong points in the streets of Apia. Perhaps some of the men proudly posing for the camera did not fully comprehend the tasks ahead of them. Some of them would not survive the month. On the right of this photograph, supervising men erecting a Gatling gun outside the British consulate, stands a young American officer of the Philadelphia. He had married just a month before, as he departed for duty in the South Pacific. He was Lieutenant Philip Lansdale. He would die on Easter Saturday. In a bid to establish Malietoa's legitimacy, the British and Americans decided to impose a government, in a ceremony conducted under a strong naval guard in March 1899. Malietoa Tainu was brought ashore from HMS Porpoise. Then there was a parade through the streets of Apia, with as much pomp as the foreign forces could muster. There were Malietoa's loyal warriors, bands from the ships, and troops of sailors and marines, all part of a parade that perhaps had not been seen before in Apia. The flag was raised at Mulinu after the coronation, as a new government was proclaimed. The ceremony was not followed by the usual universal rejoicing, because in reaction to the coronation, the followers of Mataafa launched new attacks on settlements around Apia and in the town itself. The attacks were pressed home and only repulsed with the aid of bombardments from the ship's guns. Here the Philadelphia is firing its forward 6-inch guns to break up concentrations of Mataafa's warriors.